Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? East Palestine, Ohio, a small American town that became a national story when a train carrying chemicals derailed. Do you remember the images of the flames and that massive dark plume? Across the nation, this catastrophe and people's perceptions about the government and industry's response drove mistrust through the roof. Today, more than 2 years later, where do things stand in this community? The soil, drinking water, the air. Is it safe? What about the residents who report health ailments? Today, we're talking with two individuals who, inspired by what they heard on our show, teamed up. One from MAHA, the other from the Yale School of Public Health. Together, they've joined a team of university researchers trying to get answers for the people of East Palestine, Ohio, a community still living with fear and uncertainty. How did these two override our default setting of opposition to actually work together? Are they facing blowback from their own communities? Could their approach be a model for the rest of us? And most importantly, where do things stand for the people of East Palestine? We'll hear from a resident from the region. Let's get started. Hey, welcome back, everyone.
Welcome, everyone.
Hey, guys.
So we have a special episode today for everyone. Do I say that every episode? I'm like trying to remember if I say,
we do, but nobody remembers.
That's
but this is technically not a special episode. It's in our regular slot.
No, but it's special. The content is special.
Okay. It's in a regular slot, but it's a really special episode.
And we're really special.
No, seriously, we're so excited about this one. Look, we've been working on this episode for a long time with the different people who we're going to introduce you to in a minute. But first, who are we? If you're a first-time listener, I'm Brenda Adhikari.
Yeah, and I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark.
Yeah, Mark is a physician and medical reporter. Maggie's a virologist at Hopkins. Brenda and I are journalists, and this is Why Should I Trust You? This is a podcast all about the breakdown in our trust and what we can do about it. And that happens to be the theme of our episode today.
Yeah, we're taking a break, just one episode, to bring you some positive news that doesn't involve different sides battling each other for a change. So today we have the story of how our little show helped connect two forces of nature, one from the Make America Healthy Again movement and the other from the Yale School of Public Health, to combine their talents and energies to help research the long-term health of the residents of East Palestine, Ohio, still living in the fallout from that horrific train and chemical fire. So we've had the conversation. It was terrific. But Tom, before we dive into this collaboration and what it's all about and get to our guests, let's bring everyone up to speed on this train disaster and where things stand for the residents today.
Yeah, and that's most importantly. We're going to talk about the collaboration and the research and the science, but it ultimately comes down to the most important thing, which are the residents of this community. And this story begins just like a little bit before 9 p.m. on February 3rd back in 2023. And that's when a Norfolk Southern freight train derailed in the tiny town of East Palestine, Ohio, which is right near the Pennsylvania border. It was a train hauling over 100 different cars. You know, we honestly see different numbers of how many were there in total, but it was big, many cars. And there were about a dozen of them loaded with hazardous chemicals. On board, you had, a clear liquid with a strong odor that's used to make caulks and adhesives and used in paints. You had a colorless liquid that's used to make varnish, many different types of chemicals. One in particular that we need to note, which is vinyl chloride, and that's a colorless gas used to make plastic products. It's toxic and flammable, and that will become important to the story in just a moment. But as a result of the crash, fire erupts. First responders, state officials, the EPA all descend on the community. And residents within a 1-mile radius of the crash are told to shelter in place. And then they're told to evacuate. We move through the weekend. There's smaller fires smoldering at the derailment site. And by Sunday, though, Ohio's governor issues a warning that there is real fear that the chemicals in one of the cars could explode. And if it did, it would rain shrapnel down on the community as far out as a mile and release dangerous chemicals. He calls for a full evacuation. So by then now, you've got National Guard vehicles, even snowplows blocking roads leading into the community of 5,000. And you've got people packing up and racing out of the community. And it even got to the place where authorities say, if you don't leave now, you could face arrest. So initial air and water tests showed that at this point, no dangerous levels of chemicals were, emitted into the air. But worry is rising. And that vinyl chloride, which again is both toxic, it's a carcinogen, and flammable, has led officials to make a quick decision that they should drain the cars with the chemical on board and vent the gas into the air and expand the evacuation route, all in a controlled effort to mitigate the risk of an explosion. So they vent the chemical into the air, they ignite it to burn it off. And that really is essentially what occurs on Sunday. A little over a year later from that event, in a Senate hearing, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance questioned the NTSB chair, who testified that the controlled burn may have been unnecessary because the risk, it turned out at that point, was actually decreasing of an explosion. But in the immediate aftermath of this derailment, the spill of the chemicals were released into the town soil, into a nearby stream, into the air. And that fire, that controlled burn, produced a massive black smoke plume that rose up over East Palestine, over other communities, and it was visible for miles.
Wow.
Yeah, and Tom, you mentioned that there were people on the ground, and some of those people were scientists and government officials. And just 2 days after the controlled burn, remember that burn was designed to avoid the potential dangerous explosion, but that discharged toxic and potentially deadly fumes into the air. And so the residents of East Palestine were told 2 days later that it was indeed safe for them to return to their homes. So residents were told the air quality samples in the area, quote, consistently showed readings at points below safety screening levels for contaminants of concern, end quote. And then, they don't stop as we approach the 2-week mark after the crash. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, said their tests of the air of around 500 homes, as well as the town water, appeared safe. But even with all those announcements and, declarations, residents, did complain of symptoms. They had headaches, they had coughs, eye irritation, rashes. They reported that they had smells that they were detecting, smelling of burnt plastic. People were smelling the water coming out of the faucets. But at this point, even though they were hearing this, officials were reporting that they weren't detecting concerning levels of chemicals in the air or the town's water supply. So you have this setup where you have officials saying one thing, people having their lived experience. That's a formula for fear and mistrust. And that's exactly what was happening. That was setting in. And believe it or not, so was politics. We just can't escape it. The top Democrats from the EPA and the Transportation Department did take heat for showing up late on the scene. But 3 weeks after the derailment, then former President Trump visited East Palestine with then Senator J.D. Vance. And Trump was, of course, running against President Biden, who at that point had not traveled to the town. Democrats, for their point, pointed to Trump-era rollbacks of rail safety and environmental regulations. And there's already finger pointing saying those changes may have left gaps in oversight, even though it wasn't really clear what the cause was and whether any of that could have played a role in the derailment. But Trump, went to the town, was in the firehouse. He focused on the people, declaring, "We have told you loud and clear, you are not forgotten." He also said what this community needs now are not excuses, but answers and results.
Yeah, and since shortly after that derailment, a group of researchers led from the University of Kentucky worked with local residents and health officials, including those from the National Institutes of Health, have been tracking the health of East Palestine residents. And just last week, they updated the community on what they're learning. The headline, the team say that they are finding possible health impacts, though they emphasize that much more study is needed. In one early study of 19 residents, nearly 3/4 were found to have that chemical Tom was talking about, vinyl chloride metabolites, in their urine, compared to only a small fraction that was detectable in the control group. That means they had some measurable exposure to the chemical. Blood tests in the same group revealed markers of chronic, low-grade inflammation, which of course can be associated with higher long-term risks for conditions from heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, though researchers again stress that these are preliminary findings and not proof of directly caused illness. And there are of course some caveats. The scientists caution that this is a 19-person study. It's far too small to draw broad conclusions, but is an important stepping stone for us to really understand what's going on with the health of the residents. And of course, some other findings were even more reassuring. There were no dioxins that were detected in the wristband monitors worn by residents, which means the indoor air quality in homes appeared consistent with typical U.S. households. We found no contamination in private well water samples, which again is very reassuring.
Yeah, I mean, so you have these, government agencies and departments looking at this, but we also are now in an era of scientists now academics going in and looking for themselves. But yes, the EPA tested the air, soil, and water. And at the 1 year anniversary of the disaster, they said that their round the clock air monitoring in the town had collected over 100 million data points. That is a lot of analysis in different areas. And they've held town hall meetings and with residents, and they oversaw the cleanup. And we'll ask our guests in a moment if the residents feel like that's been enough. It is that declaration, and are those findings enough to give people the reassurance they need? But in the meantime, we still also have other surveys and other academics giving us a glimpse into how some of those residents are feeling. So the University of Kentucky launched the East Palestine Train Derailment Health Tracking Study a few months after the accident. And they've been checking in with people periodically. But this summer, they released the results from their most recent check-in, which was in the spring of 2025. Now, this is a type of survey where, scientists give some caveats. It's important to emphasize that these findings reflect only the residents who responded to the survey. So it's what we call a convenience sample. So it may not be representative of the whole town. Also, these kinds of surveys, when you start asking these kinds of questions, open up some other biases in us. For example, like if people are notice and remember symptoms more after a crisis, that's sometimes a form of bias. Also, if you feel sick, you're more likely to respond to the survey. So the people who don't feel sick may not respond. And then we have this idea that fear, stress, anxiety, all those can trigger real physical reactions. But putting all of that in mind, and here's what the researchers learned more than 2 years after the disaster from those who participated in that survey. These are big numbers. 70% reported things like nose irritation, eye irritation, sore throat, so like upper respiratory stuff. Now we lower respiratory stuff, like deep into the lungs, 40% cough and wheezing. Then you have vague symptoms, right? Like headaches. 42% said they had headaches. Then even more vague symptoms, tiredness or weakness, 25% said. Interestingly, 33% of women aged 18 to 45 reported experiencing issues with their menstrual cycle. So this is just kind of, I'm raising my hand and saying, I have these things.
Boy, this is so fascinating. And, I think the reason we wanted to tell this story is to shine a spotlight on what the residents of East Palestine are going through, and also to tell you the story about how this collaboration and this partnership on the ground even happened. So when we come back, we want to introduce you and play this conversation for you of this group of people who are on the ground and studying and wanting to support the residents of East Palestine and the communities right near it. So when we come back, we'll have that conversation for you. Hey, welcome back, everyone. And we want to introduce you to this really special panel of guests we've been telling you about. We want to start with our research duo. We're talking about Elizabeth Frost of MAHA, Ohio, and Nicole Deziel of the Yale School of Public Health. Hi, you guys.
Hello.
So just some basics. Nicole and Elizabeth, they met through a connection on our program, and they kind of hatched this plan. Nicole applied for a grant with the NIH, and she was given a yes. That means in addition to Nicole's scientific firepower and Elizabeth's community organizing work, they are bringing the backing of the Yale School of Public Health with researchers Michelle Bell and James Sayers, as well as a group we'll introduce you to in a moment, the Ohio Valley Allies. Together, they will be focused on the quality of East Palestine's water. Their research is part of a newly expanded group called the East Palestine Investigation Consortium, or EPIC. It is led by the University of Kentucky and funded through grants from the NIH. So let's introduce them and who they are. So regular listeners of our show know Elizabeth Frost well by now. She works with the Make America Healthy Again movement as a grassroots organizer in Ohio. She was the Ohio State Director for Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s presidential campaign and is a co-founder of Independent Force Consulting. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
And next up is Nicole Deziel. She is an associate professor in environmental health sciences at the Yale School of Public Health and co-director of the Yale Center of Perinatal, Pediatric, and Environmental Epidemiology. Her expertise, assessing how we're exposed to environmental contaminants and what that means for our health using advanced statistical models, biomonitoring, and all the latest tools to study everything from pesticides and air pollution to industrial chemicals and drinking water contamination across America. And super relevant to what we're talking about today, she previously led a $2 million EPA-funded project examining drinking water safety and health impacts in communities across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia affected by industrial activity. Hi, Nicole. It's so great to have you.
Hi, thanks for that great introduction.
Joining us as well is Stuart Day, who is a community partner on the research team. Stuart lives just 6 miles from East Palestine, Ohio, close enough that the plume from the fire at the train crash site lingered over his home and farm for hours. After the disaster, Stuart connected with Ohio Valley Allies, a grassroots environmental advocacy organization, to help affected communities document what they were experiencing and to get answers. He became a co-creator and now serves as executive producer and co-host of the Exposure podcast, which investigates environmental health issues facing communities across the region. We're so happy to have you, Stuart.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, we've got John Clark, who's been on the pod several times. John is a former attorney who now operates a small farm in Vermont and is a writer for the MAHA Report, a popular newsletter and a big supporter of Secretary Kennedy's vision. He is committed to regenerative farming practices, and today he's writing about this collaboration to help the people of East Palestine for his newsletter, which will help amplify this good work. Welcome back, John.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start with Elizabeth and Nicole. Elizabeth, tell us the story of how you guys got together.
Sure. So, this podcast really was an opportunity for kind of shared interests, I think, to come through. So I have to really lob a lot of the credit in terms of this partnership back to you and to the podcast team, Brenda, because, you and I had a lot of private conversations about what's going on in East Palestine. I'm working with this MAHA organization in Ohio, and you're asking me a lot of questions that I didn't even know the answer to. And so that's, a wake up call moment for me where my team and I were like, we have to get on the ground in East Palestine, and more so than we ever have before. Of course, Bobby's been there. Bobby was involved in, some of the litigation and representing the families in East Palestine before his presidential campaign. And I think, this strong passion for not just the people of East Palestine or, the surrounding area, but, victims of toxic exposure in general. And so then I'm realizing there's something happening, less than 4 hours away from me that I really feel like, was kind of getting away from me, and that there was a lot more that I could be doing in my position and with my resources. So my team and I, we go to East Palestine and we're surveying residents. We want to know, what is it that is really driving the residents, crazy right now? What's keeping them up at night? What is that burning question that's not being addressed? Or if it is being addressed, that they don't trust the information that they're receiving. And so that was our goal. Our goal was to figure out, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? What information are they receiving? What information is there but is missing them for some reason? And what questions still need answered? Around the time that we're planning one of our trips to East Palestine, I get an email from you, Brenda, introducing me to Dr. Nicole Deziel at Yale School of Public Health. And you just asked, hey, I'd love to get on the ground in East Palestine. Is there an opportunity or something that you'd recommend? And I said, come on out. We're doing something like next week. And, to my surprise, she didn't waste any time. And about a week after that first email, we were in East Palestine together, meeting at a Subway and, trying to figure out, what is it that we really, want to identify from the residents in this moment. And so we talked a little bit about the questions that we had prepared for that day, how we were going to approach the residents. And we met the residents at their door. It was important with the questions that we were asking to kind of know where people were, or where they were living at the time of the spill and the controlled burn. And so, versus just going straight online and, doing it what I would consider the easy way as a consultant. It's much easier to meet people online than in the sweltering July heat. But we wanted to know, where were you when this happened? Where were you sleeping, and where were you, feeding your family and buying your groceries, in the months and weeks after this? And, we asked questions like, do you eat the local food? Are you concerned about the safety of the local food in East Palestine?
Elizabeth, I love you talking about kind of how you and Nicole joined forces. Let me go to you, Nicole, for a second. I mean, just put ourselves in your shoes here. You have a MAHA organizer. You're at the Yale School of Public Health. What kind of goes through your mind? Because you got on that plane to East Palestine real fast, girl. I remember, the email was sent and you were like, I'm getting on that plane. I've talked to so many people in public health as well as in MAHA who get really anxious and nervous to talk to each other sometimes. What was going through your mind?
Well, the announcement was made that there was this funding opportunity to support better understanding of the exposures and long-term health outcomes in East Palestine. So this announcement was put out by NIH and JD Vance on this press release, like a press conference. And one of the requirements for applicants, for researchers applying to this, was that you had to have deep experience in the area. And so first, it took me a couple days just to decide whether or not I should go for the response. And I was, in contact, I think, with you, Brenda. I was trying to decide whether or not I even wanted to do this. It was a very short time window. But then I thought a lot about the deep relationships I had with Ohio Valley allies and all my fracking research in the area. And there were just so many parallels between fracking as sort of this emerging kind of industrial activity that releases all these pollutants to the air, the water, creates stress, very similar to the derailment, which also released a lot of different complex mixtures of pollutants. So I was sitting in my office in New Haven and reading all these papers and news stories and looking at the data. There is a fair amount of data available, but it immediately became clear that I just needed to get down there. As an environmental epidemiologist, a lot of time is spent in my office looking at the data, but it always involves some component of going to the community and going to the field and seeing what things are like on the ground. So it just was very fortuitous that my dean, Megan Ranney, had been a guest on the show. I had listened to some of the episodes, so I kind of knew there was this very respectful dialogue. But yeah, when Elizabeth gave me the opportunity to just go, and Elizabeth is all action. So I didn't want to pass up that opportunity to have a trusted member of the community, to help give me access to hear really from the community what was going through their minds. Because there's only so much you can get from, reading papers and even news articles. So I did have a little trepidation, I think being, from an Ivy League and, would I even be an asset showing up at people's doorsteps? Would people want to talk to me? Would MAHA really be interested in having me come along? But Elizabeth was so open and respectful and positive, and it was just a fantastic experience. I so appreciated being able to join her group and be part of those conversations with the residents. It completely changed how I was looking at my proposal and the scientific questions pre and post visit. So it was extremely valuable.
I just want to ask Stuart and Elizabeth a question, just picking up on what Nicole just said. Here's Nicole hopping on a plane, coming to Subway to buy a sandwich with you guys, or with Elizabeth at least, in 100-degree heat. She's got lots of letters after her name, PhDs and whatnot. She's from Yale University. She lives in Connecticut. She's an expert. we're in a movement, we're in a time now where there's so much mistrust that a lot of people just don't trust people like Nicole. You guys were the problem. What was going through your minds? Did you guys hesitate with Nicole, or did you say, you know what? I'm aware of that kind of hesitation around people with expertise from Ivy League schools, but like she's an expert and I want that. Like, how did that play out for both of you? Maybe Stuart, as you sort of entered this into this story, like what was your perception of Nicole and whether you could trust her?
My introduction with Nicole was actually a little different and happened a little earlier than this. So Ohio Valley Allies was founded by Jill Hunkler, who was a fracking refugee. She was essentially pushed off of her homestead because of the fracking boom in Barnesville, Ohio. And so Jill and Nicole met at that time, which was, what would you say, Nicole, 12 plus years ago?
About 10 years, yeah.
And so Nicole had been a guest on our podcast prior to the announcement of the East Palestine public health grant. So I kind of knew Nicole already.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I've always had a real respect for the scientific method and science. I also have my own sort of issues with institutional academia, journalism, science, et cetera. But I tend to think that I'm a little bit more centrist when it comes to all of that. And I try really hard to meet people as individuals where they are. And I try to, whether I'm interviewing folks on the podcast or, you know, just dealing with people in my own life, I really try to give people the benefit of the doubt and not bring all of this loaded framework into the relationship. And so I think for me, it was a little different. I just was very interested in having somebody like Nicole take on this issue with East Palestine precisely because I trusted Nicole personally and knew that she would do a good job and wouldn't be so inclined to bring in bias.
That's so interesting. That personal relationship got you there in terms of trust. Elizabeth, what about you? Did you hesitate?
No, I don't think there was really any hesitation on my side. I will credit some of that to having built, you know, a personal relationship with Megan Ranney and understanding kind of the culture that she's created and fostered at Yale School of Public Health. I can't say for certain that, you know, if it was a situation where I didn't know anyone, you know, associated with the program, that there wouldn't be some, what I would consider maybe a healthy dose of skepticism. You know, knowing Megan definitely helped, you know, kind of understand, I think, the heart of where this was coming from.
Did you get any blowback from folks in the MAHA community when you said, hey, I'm pairing up with Yale School of Public Health?
I'll be honest, I think not everyone loves it, but sometimes it's like the silence that speaks the loudest. In those situations, you know, some folks are excited and then some folks, it's just kind of like, you know, they'll clap for other things. But I don't get any sense that that it has anything to do with lack of excitement over movement of things happening in East Palestine. I just think it's what you pointed to, that there is, I think, some sense of trepidation. And to some extent, I think that the only way to move through that is through building those individual relationships that Stuart talked about. Because, you know, as I hear myself speaking about what kind of got me to relax going into this, I think a lot of it is that personal relationship.
Did you have to vouch for her? Did you have to say, no, guys, Nicole's good. She comes in peace.
Yeah. I don't think it really came to that. No one was ever so pointed. You know, I just get the sense that some people are more excited about branded MAHA wins than sometimes things that you have to read between the lines to see, you know, and so for me, this is something that I don't have to read between the lines. You know, I'm looking that the residents of East Palestine are benefiting, that we have an Ivy League research institution that genuinely wants to hear what it is that the residents are most concerned about and would rather hear it direct from the residents than what folks with, you know, some sense of authority are telling them the problem is.
Nicole, how about you? In academia, are people like, wait, who are you working with? What?
Yeah, I think it has maybe it is a little surprising. Yeah, but I'm really proud of this relationship, and I've long spent my career kind of being very open to talking to all groups. When I started my fracking research, I went and spoke to the oil and gas industry about it. I just think, as Elizabeth said, sort of these personal relationships, keeping lines of communication open is really important. I think everyone has a perspective or data or context that's useful. But I kind of like talking about it. I tell a lot of people about this collaboration. I think it's novel. I think it's important for people to hear in these times when we're so divided. And yeah, some scientists are a little unhappy about some of the other aspects of some of this, like, quote unquote MAHA agenda around vaccines. But to me, I just try to look for alignment. Like this is an opportunity to center issues around the environment that I think haven't really received enough attention in the past. So I kind of move through that quickly and try to highlight areas of alignment.
So just looking at this screen here on our call, we have a community advocate. We have an epidemiologist, PhD Yale researcher. And we also have Stuart on this call, who was really the purpose. He symbolizes the who and, the impact. I know there's going to be a paper that's coming out of this, obviously, and there's data being collected. Where are we on this project? Are we in the beginning? Are we in the middle? Like, just quickly, just where are we on this project, and what is this project? Let's start with Nicole on that.
Okay, yes. So the project, well, first of all, the project that we proposed was, I think, really visionary, but it got cut down quite a bit. So we are going to be focusing on the drinking water pathway, which is something I am really excited about. As Elizabeth knows, this was something we heard a lot about from the residents. A lot of people aren't drinking their water. They don't trust the water. They don't believe the water data. So I think this is a chance for us to really address some community concerns and data gaps. So our project has 3 parts. We're going to start with a community survey to just get a little more information about residents' concerns, about what pollutants they might be more interested in, locations they may want, some of this water modeling to be focused at. In some cases, and Stuart can speak to this, I think they didn't feel like necessarily the right places were measured or the right chemicals were measured or at the right time. So we're going to be doing some modeling to better predict, kind of emanating from the derailment, where would the water pollutants go and which areas might be more vulnerable. So it's community survey, gathering all the existing data that we have, and then working with my colleague, Jim Sayers, to build a model. And we are just at the very beginning. And in fact, we were supposed to go to East Palestine, but the government shutdown has kind of delayed some things. But that will be our first step, starting with a survey of.
Got it. So if I'm hearing you correctly, the arch of this is that we're going to study the drinking water and its impact on the community after this, horrible accident. Stuart, you're living in this community. You're hearing a Yale scientist tell you that they're coming on the ground to evaluate this. And this is in the setting of, from your home, you saw the fire, the burning, you saw the smoke, you felt the impact directly. At the same time, the health authorities, the EPA, they went in, they tested the water. They, offered to test your homes. They came in and said, look, we're going to look at 500 homes and see if their drinking water and the air quality are good. They talk about testing something like over 100 million or 115 million samples. I know that was air, but they're also testing the water. They haven't tested the well water as extensively, I don't think, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But you're hearing all of this. You're hearing the scientists there now to sort of see the aftermath. You've lived it. What are you feeling?
That's a big question. Well, first of all, I do want to clarify, our farm is 6 miles from East Palestine. Like, I don't want to take wind out of the sails of the people that are actually in East Palestine. We know a lot of people in East Palestine. It is our community, but I just have to say that.
You're qualifying. You were 6 miles away from the accident scene.
Correct.
Okay.
So I didn't actually witness the literal derailment and the fire. But what happened was when they did the controlled burn, that plume migrated over to our farm and kind of rested in our valley for a number of hours.
Are you downstream from East Palestine?
We're basically directly east.
East. Okay, thank you.
And so it was a panicky night because I had an infant at the time and an older child, and we live in a 180-year-old drafty farmhouse. And so my initial confrontation with all of this was calling the EPA, calling the DEP, looking for answers as far as like, what should we do right now? And there were no answers. And so that was kind of like the initial red flag for us. And then following from there, it was a lot of just feeling like we weren't being told the whole story, and there was information being omitted, and it was just what we were being told was not really jiving with like the lived experience of everybody in our communities. That was like the groundwork of it all, of just feeling like something was off.
Speaking of your lived experience, did you have, or did anyone in your family have the things that we've talked about, like the irritation in the nose, the eye irritation, the coughing, the headaches, anything like that? Did you have any of that?
We all developed coughs, and I had headaches. My father-in-law and I have dealt with chronic fatigue issues kind of separate of this, but they certainly were worse after the train derailment. But mostly it was what we didn't know was the concern. We didn't know what we had been exposed to, how much of it we had been exposed to. And the agencies that were supposed to be providing those answers and that help just weren't. And actually, that was how I got involved with the Ohio Valley Allies in the first place, was that Jill Hunkler, our founder, she was the one that came to our farm and did soil and water samples for us.
But they did tell you, they told you after 2 days, the community could go back to their homes, and that the air and the water quality testing did not show any levels that were unsafe. Isn't that what they told you?
It took some time to be told that explicitly. I mean, one of the issues was that most of the information we were getting was from like social media. The media did a pretty poor job, I thought, initially of really reporting what was going on. And so that was kind of disconcerting. When I called the EPA to ask them what we should do, should we evacuate or should we stay in place? They didn't have an answer for me. That was the answer I needed, and we've been running these trains in this country for 100+ years. You would think that we would know those answers. The fact that later whistleblower and FOIA requests showed that there was a different internal dialogue happening than what was publicly available. The fact that when I looked at the data and I was seeing that, yes, they were testing in volumes, but they weren't testing for some of the breakdown chemicals. So vinyl chloride, when you burn it, turns into other things, phosgene for one, and they weren't really testing for that. So there were just these like little clues that came over time that just made me feel more and more that I wasn't getting the whole story.
But Stuart, when I read like the EPA, they put out like anniversary documents summarizing where things are. And as Mark said, they list off all the surveillance that's been done. They show photographs of the work. They force the company to help clean this up and pay for it. And they keep sort of repeating that they have not found anything dangerous. Mm-hmm. You believe that? You don't believe that? Just how do you respond to that?
I mean, yes and no. Like, I think that, so for example, the plume, if you go on their website, they have a map of the plume, which is based on a retroactive model that they created. The plume on their website goes northwest. The actual plume went east, but they used that northwest model to evaluate where they were taking their testing results or their sampling. If you look at that same plume map, there's a very heavy soot deposit southeast of East Palestine. And yet, when you look at the maps of where they took sampling, none of those samples happened there. I do believe that they've sampled a lot. I do believe that they've removed a lot of material from the actual site. The question is, were they taking samples in the smartest locations? Were they sampling for the right chemical compound? I mean, I just named one of the biggest issues. These chemicals, when burned, turn into other hazardous chemicals. And some of those byproduct chemicals, those constituent chemicals, do not show up either at all or in high volumes in their tests. So they weren't looking for some of the chemicals that it seems like they should have been looking for. And, I'm not a scientist. And so for me, this just creates big question marks. I'm relying on experts to answer those questions. And so far, there hasn't been a good answer for those questions.
Nicole, you are a scientist. This is your wheelhouse. Do you have big questions here? Like what goes through your mind when you hear Stuart and this disconnect between what the government is saying they did and they were so thorough and it's okay, and these very serious questions that Stuart and other community members that you probably heard walking around with Elizabeth have?
Yeah, I mean, it raises a lot of concerns for me, for sure. I mean, what I think of is first, we have to believe the community and their lived experience. And if people were experiencing headaches and coughs, even if all the tests weren't showing elevated levels, then I think we have to think, well, maybe we're not measuring for the right thing or at the right time. So I think we need to kind of start with that. What I also think about, though, is that this work is hard, this sort of detective work to try to figure out kind of what to measure, where, have the right equipment in place. In part, I just think we have not invested nearly enough in our environmental monitoring infrastructure. And there's a real, I think, environmental justice issue when it comes to rural areas where we have almost no monitoring available. Like a lot of the monitoring that we do have is concentrated in more densely populated urban areas. People on well water are kind of left to fend for themselves. The well water is completely outside the regulatory system. So in part, I think, for example, we've invested billions of dollars to decode our human genome. And then the environment is such a big factor in our lives. And I do think if we had a better infrastructure in place, maybe these experts, would have access to better data to be able to answer these questions. I guess the last point I'll say is, what Stuart is saying is something Elizabeth and I heard over and over again from the community. Concerns about where samples were taken. They weren't taken in the right place, the right time, the right combinations. So we do hope that our project, which is more modeling, will try to get at some of this, at least in some part.
Nicole, thank you so much for that. I think it's interesting to highlight all of these different factors, from the regulations, the funding, and the detective work that goes into figuring out these problems. And Stuart, thank you for your accounting for what it was like to go through that process. And I wonder if, Nicole, you might just elaborate on what the science is showing you so far and what sort of complexities we're looking at. And for the residents, is this something that's years down the line? What are the tangible, how are we going to move to solutions for those who are still very much in the thick of it?
Yeah, so I mean, we're just getting started in our project, but my current review of the data does show that there are some elevated levels in some places, but it just tends to be more localized or more episodic. And again, this is something we've seen before, even with fracking. There's a lot of parallels to many other environmental disasters where, for example, in our fracking work, we didn't find widespread contamination of the water just everywhere around fracking sites, but we did find some evidence of impairments in certain places. And this is the tricky part. Trying to kind of get at the complexity of the environment with meteorology and soil and water flow and topography. All of these things can influence the environment, and it just can be difficult to capture all of that.
Nicole, I have a question. Mm-hmm. Is the air and water in East Palestine safe right now?
I never say that anything is safe. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, first of all, I haven't carefully reviewed all the data because we are just getting started. I also know that we haven't tested everywhere. I think I would need to do a careful review of the data to better understand and answer that question.
So that's where science enters.
Yeah, I know. And this is so frustrating. I guess the other thing I was going to say to Maggie's point is, I can hear people being frustrated, the community being frustrated, that science moves at a glacial pace compared to what community wants answers, and we are trained to have caveats and be careful with how we're communicating. We can get into trouble sometimes when we simplify things. But I think it is important to kind of give information in a simple way, recognizing that it could evolve as we get more data.
Elizabeth, I want to bring you in. respond to that, because I can imagine Nicole gave a very honest, precise answer. They're still reviewing the data. If I'm living in East Palestine, does that mean I feel okay drinking the water, bathing in it, buying agriculture while the scientists are pouring through the data? I want you to tell me what you're hoping to get out of this. While Nicole is focusing on the science and the toxicology, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? And where does it lead you to want to make an action point?
Yeah. So I can say that in my experience of surveying the residents, there are residents who do feel safe. They do feel like the water's safe and that the air is safe and that they're safe. So I want to give those folks some space and some room in this conversation. But overwhelmingly, the people in East Palestine have questions. And when you have those questions, it's impossible to feel safe. The same way that Nicole can't answer that question in good faith, I think, we can't answer that question yet. And maybe some of those answers are in this data that's already out there. There's another component to this that I'm sure we'll talk about, which is this data is not compiled easily for anyone, even the trained scientists, to comb through it. But putting that aside, to your question about what do the residents think or what are the residents feeling, I see that as my role in this is to be the communicator with the residents and to help open that line of communication. I've spent time in front of probably 10,000 doors for political campaigns. And to me, this is way more important and it's way more meaningful in the sense that we are able to let the residents inform this process because it is excruciatingly slow. And even if all of the levers and all of the proper resources were activated on day one when this happened, which we know from things that we've heard and in terms of, this lack of funding and that 10 million still really isn't enough to do everything. Like the research was still cut drastically. Even in this perfect world, science takes time. Some residents will tell you that makes them want to just leave and that they can't afford to leave. That was a concern that Nicole and I heard at the doors and then from online survey responses as well. People want to go, but they can't afford to go. People want to have their homes tested, but no one's offering, 500 homes, if that's the number that was tested is a drop in the bucket to the amount of people that were impacted, but all of the residents that we spoke to, only one person had their home tested because they were picked in another research project. And so I think there's so many unanswered questions that it's impossible for the residents to really feel safe right now unless you're choosing to feel safe. And that's from the folks who did tell us that they're not concerned about things. They also very directly communicated that they don't see the point in worrying because they don't plan on leaving.
Well, so Elizabeth, that's so fascinating. And Stuart, I wonder if I can bring you in because it seems to me a central tension a lot of times, as I observe in many kind of these toxic exposure stories, right, is that the event happens, then there's an immediate response to sort of secure the area. Then the scientists come in to sort of do their methodical testing that can take years. And then the residents are like, what do we do in the meantime? Am I getting that right? And then Stuart, explain to me, I want to also go back to something else you said, because I remember covering this story as a journalist. And the thing that got all our attention were the pictures. It was insane, right? It literally looked like a nuclear explosion. It was in the middle of the night. It was like, I'd never seen anything like it. And it was, I'm just being honest with you, the pictures were driving the story. What goes through your mind when you had everybody kind of parachute into the area probably in that moment. I think that tends to happen a lot. I think it happened with Flint, Michigan. It happened with East Palestine. I'm asking you a lot here, but help me also understand that feeling of all eyes are on you. And then it feels like no eyes are on you. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, I think that's a very real feeling when these things happen. I think probably the people of Parkersburg, West Virginia felt that way during the DuPont fiasco as well. Yeah, and there's also this issue where there's a lot of context that's lost when you have people come in from outside, right? So, I've spoken to a couple farmers who they had these national media outlets want to interview them after the derailment. And they were really concerned. They wanted answers about what they and their families and their animals and their land had been exposed to. But at the same time, they felt like if it's determined that my land has been poisoned, I might not be able to farm anymore, you know? And so there was this like tension between these media people that had no understanding of that part of it coming in and just wanting to highlight and highlight and highlight. And meanwhile, these people were like, well, what happens if we draw this attention to this area and it's determined that like we shouldn't be producing food for people, you know? And there was this real fear amongst many farmers that might they don't want to produce toxic food for people. They don't want to. I know of one family in particular in East Palestine had a business that was kind of agriculturally based, and they put themselves out of business because they were just afraid of what they might be giving consumers.
They like preempted it, is what you're saying.
Yeah, they just couldn't conscientiously do it anymore because of the fear of what contamination they might be passing on to people. And so there's this like constant tension, particularly in agricultural communities related to these kinds of events, where they want to know for their own sort of health and safety of their family and their consumers and their communities, but at the same time they almost don't want to know because it could put them out of business forever. So there's that, and the media just doesn't have that kind of understanding or sensitivity to that. And so that can feel very frustrating. And then, as you said, you know, it's kind of like they swoop in for their sound bites. And a lot of times they prod you to get a sound bite out of you. And then they get it and then they run. And that's actually one of the main reasons that we started our show Exposure, was because we wanted to be able to give a platform for people to really tell their story authentically and not do that to them.
That's really very interesting. I think what you're putting your finger on here, Stuart, which is, you know, we live in an age of media. We live in an age in content's being monetized. Do you feel that people are coming in and sort of cannibalizing your experience to create content and to haul out of town and sort of profit off of that? Is that what you're sort of outlining here?
Well, I mean, we live in a social media content influencer era now where that's kind of true, but it's sort of always been true with even like legacy media too. I mean, it's always been a profit machine, right? Legacy media has never been nonprofit. So yeah, I mean, I think that's always been there. That hasn't been I haven't personally experienced that in regards to East Palestine, but I think it's there for sure, you know, in any kind of event like this. And the other thing is, like, when that happens, when they come in, get their soundbite and bounce, this story that we're talking about with Nicole and Elizabeth, and that almost never gets covered then because they're gone already. And so you don't see the rebuilding part. You don't see the solutions part. And so it's just kind of this cycle of negative storytelling without the hopeful aftermath part of it.
You know, we talked about all the players here, and one of the biggest players in all of this actually became politics. And it became who came on the scene in East Palestine a couple of weeks later. You know, you even had a Senate hearing about, you know, was that controlled burn necessary? It also taps into the pressured environment. And I think sometimes we forget, we have to take a step back, you know, that you had this train, you had the vinyl chloride, the dangerous chemical that was there. You had a situation where they were really concerned about the temperature rising in the environment where that chemical was. And if it got to a certain point, it could explode. In a Senate hearing, you even hear then Senator J.D. Vance, now Vice President, saying the responders only had 13 minutes to make that decision about whether they should do the controlled burn, right? That's a pressured environment to decide. And then, you know, now we're dealing with what are the environmental and health effects after that. Because politics played a role early on, and now we're a couple of years later, Stuart, do you feel that there's still politics at play here, or is that receded and it's just now time for good old-fashioned science and community work?
I mean, I almost don't know how to answer that question, because it just seems like politics is never goes away anymore. It's just every conversation we have gets dragged into the political arena. I do think it was very important what you said, who showed up in East Palestine. And I think it was you can draw any kind of opinion you want about the motives of why people showed up and why they didn't, but I do think that people, especially around here, paid attention to that, paid attention to who showed up and who didn't.
And you mean
Showed up.
specifically that President Trump showed up?
President Trump showed up, and this is I'm kind of regurgitating what I've heard people say. President Trump showed up while Biden was in Ukraine. Buttigieg didn't show up for quite a while. Vance was there on the ground often, and that was something that people in this area really noticed.
Do you care that may have been for optics only at an election season? Obviously we can't say that that's why. Nobody can attribute it that reason, but the fact is that it was a political season. Does that matter?
I mean, it matters, but it also doesn't, because that's politics, Like if you're not going to play the game, if you're a politician, you have to play the game, and you play it the way that it's played. Personally, it was obvious to me that was what it was. But to like I said, it moved the needle for people in the area, and that's really all that matters.
Follow up on your question, your great question, Mark. Nicole, I think you wrote somewhere that on some level, MAHA is public health now. And I think what you were getting at, although I should just ask you what you were getting at, is that someone like Elizabeth is critical to help connect someone like you to the communities. It's learning from the community folks that helps guide your research, just like how the stream that runs through town heads, into these fallen communities, or when they release the chemicals at the wreck site, that would seep into the groundwater, or the plume would land on people's backyards and they had private wells. Like, you need to talk to people. And MAHA sometimes can help make that happen. And that's critical for public health. Is that right? Is that where we are right now?
I think that, we can do the best studies and find and identify all these environmental problems, but if it doesn't lead to any change, it doesn't matter. So if MAHA and other stakeholders can help get people interested, or be a facilitator to communicate the latest information, and that helps people make more informed choices or helps change policies, then I think that's great. I think we need all kinds of people working on these issues. I mean, one thing that I've kind of observed from listening to the other podcasts is it seems like, there's just different segments of the public that respond differently to different parts of information. I think a lot of the MAHA folks, they want the details and the nuance and the complexity. And when you oversimplify things, it's very suspicious, and I think they want to be able to have all the information and have the agency to make their own choices. Whereas other segments of the population just want to know, is this safe? Can I drink this water? Can I, if I buy this product at the store, is it safe for my kids? So I just think we need lots of different people talking about the environment more and communicating these risks. And I certainly think MAHA could be instrumental to just helping, bridge those gaps between the quote unquote experts and the consumers and the residents.
Nicole, I think you might be describing, there are two paths to trust, or several paths to trust. I mean, one path to trust is you just doing the science. I actually don't really need to see the details, but you telling me it's safe, that's a version of trust, and an acceptable version of trust. Then there's another playbook for trust, which is what you just described. Show me all of the details, and then I'll trust you. Even though the conclusion may be the same, it's just sort of two paths to trust. Do you think that this project that you're working on and collaborating on with Elizabeth, which path to trust are you taking? Are you going to do the Cliff Notes version of science so that we can get an answer fast? Because that's also a path to trust, because we don't have time to wait because I'm thirsty. I need to know if I can drink the water. Or is your project going to do the MAHA path to trust?
Well, I hope we're going to do both, because I think that's the whole point, that there's no one way to communicate something that works for everybody. So I think having some simple fact sheets, some, website or dashboard information. I mean, Elizabeth talked about this right now. One problem is there is tons of data out there, but it's on PDF files at different places. There's nothing synthesized to kind of give people simple information. So I hope we can do that. But also a big part of this project is to have community meetings and community engagement and walk through things with people. I mean, I know a lot of these have already happened, and Stuart has attended a lot of these meetings. But yeah, so I hope we can take a multi-pronged approach because different things will work better for different constituents.
Stuart, are you sensing that with the announcement of this grant, with Secretary Kennedy saying that East Palestine is a priority for this administration and for MAHA, are residents feeling that support? Are you getting the sense that there is a bit of a morale boost from that? Or does it feel like tell me when you have the results in?
You know, like Nicole and Elizabeth have both said, it's not a monolith. And there are people who are just tired of hearing about this and want to move on. And there's people who are still very much concerned about it. And I think for the people who have remained sort of plugged in to this issue, yes, they are encouraged that their community and this issue is being taken seriously enough for the government to step in and offer funding for real research on the issue that they're most concerned about, which is long-term health impacts. So I think that it is there. It's not something that, like, you know, if you go down to the coffee shop here, you're not going to really hear much. No one's going to be talking about it much. But I think in the back of everyone's mind, it's always good to know that you're being taken seriously and you're not being just forgotten.
Elizabeth, let me ask you something. You know, a couple of episodes ago, we did this polling episode. And one of the things that struck all of us was that something like 3/4 of Republicans and the same amount of Democrats want to hold chemical polluters accountable, want our environment cleaned up of toxic chemicals. Like, I know it seems like common sense to us now, but that was actually not a common kind of thread for a lot of Republicans for a really long time. I guess my question for you is, I think I know the answer, but my question for you is, what is happening? Like, is this an opportunity that you're seeing, particularly as somebody in the MAHA movement? Like, what does success look like? And do you see the needle possibly being moved on an issue like this because you have so much overwhelming support to do something about toxins in our environment right now?
Yeah, it's really exciting to see that there's so much bipartisan support happening around the issue of toxic exposure and environmental contamination. And I mean, there's so many different issues that fall under that umbrella, everything from, you know, pesticide companies to Norfolk Southern or DuPont. I think to answer your question about what's happening, I think East Palestine happened. I think DuPont happened. I think glyphosate happened. And I think our rural communities, which tend to be our reddest communities, are the places where these things keep happening. And there's a real wake-up call that I think happens when you can't breathe like you used to breathe. And everyone in the community knows exactly, you know, where this is coming from, you know, whether that's something happening in East Palestine or a completely different toxic exposure somewhere else. Nicole said it best, like, you have to listen to the residents and what their experiences are. And, you know, if you don't have the answers for those, you need to ask different questions. And so I think this is like a political, I don't even want to say political. I really just think it's a health renaissance where people are saying, I want to be free to go out and play with my kids and not worry about if they're being poisoned or I'm being poisoned. And when it comes to toxic exposures, it's a little different than food because, yes, some people have limitations. A lot of people have limitations on what they can eat, but no amount of resources can allow you to escape toxic air, toxic water. And so I think this has just come to affect everyone so boldly and so drastically that party lines can't be blinded to it anymore.
I want to ask you guys about a term that we've kicked around, and I know you're all thinking about it, which is this term safe. Nicole, how should we think about that term safe? Is the water safe? Like, what are we asking? How should we be asking that question when it comes to the hard science?
Yeah, thanks for raising this again, because I feel like I may not have answered that as fully earlier when we were discussing this. The reason I'm always skeptical when especially a politician says the air is perfectly safe or the water is perfectly safe, because everything carries some risk. People may have heard kind of the dose makes the poison. Even just pure water, if you drink too much of it, you can get hyponatremia. You can actually die from it. So that's why I just try not to use absolutisms. Yeah, I think the EPA sets these things like 1 in 10,000 risks, or 1 in a million risks is kind of what we as a society have deemed as acceptable. So if having this, lead in our water or some pollutant in our sunscreen only yields a 1 in 10,000 added adverse health event, then we kind of say that's okay. It's kind of a probability. But yeah, I think that's something that could be debated. I also just want to bring up to thinking about what's safe and what's not. I think a lot of people assume that if something kind of is in the store and available, then it may have been deemed safe. But we have about 80,000 chemicals that are in commercial use, and only a small fraction have ever even been evaluated or have sufficient data to evaluate, because many of these chemicals were just grandfathered in. We'd like to feel safe when we buy products and use chemicals, but as it stands, because of our regulatory system, many chemicals have not been shown to be safe. In fact, the burden is on scientists like me to prove that they're harmful, rather than chemicals are kind of innocent until proven guilty, rather than having to be demonstrated to be safe at the outset.
Guys, I think you're hitting on something about safe, and we have a regulatory system in place that impacts what we figure out as safe. Like you mentioned, the EPA. We also have a MAHA contingency, which they kind of lay out what's safe, and then we have our politicians saying what's safe. And I think a lot of people would agree that we're kind of lagging in holding these chemical polluters and companies accountable and cleaning up the environment. And what does the larger picture look like in terms of the EPA under this administration? This administration is, historically a pro-industry, anti-regulation agency. And if we're talking about safe, there you have a little tension. I want to go to each of you on this. We could maybe start with Stuart. What do you think about whether or not this administration is doing it, and is it in line with keeping us safe with the industry stance?
No, I don't think so. But I also don't think it's unique to this administration. I mean, we've been dealing with a pro-corporate, pro-industry government for generations. And this issue of what is safe is really critical. And this is something that, you were pushing me on earlier about how, well, the EPA says that it's safe, and therefore, don't I believe that? Don't I accept that? And I think one of the reasons that I have trouble with that word specifically is because everything that I've learned about permitting and regulations and how these thresholds are established through my work with exposure, and just seeing how, if you're looking at strictly like safe in terms of what allows for a human body to thrive, you would say 0 exposure to benzene. But if you're looking at in terms of, well, what's quote unquote acceptable for economic reasons, then you're going to find a different threshold. And if you're looking in terms of, legalities and trying to find loopholes and workarounds through the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, or you're going to have different ideas of what that is. And so I think it's really important that when we have these conversations about, don't you trust that you're being told it's safe, you have to kind of ask, well, what is the framework of that term, in this case? Like, what's the lens through which we're seeing safe? Because if safe is about an appropriate risk so that we don't diminish our economy, then I don't know. I would push back on that, because I don't want kids exposed to benzene because someone wants to make money.
I mean, look, we're not going to get into this right now, but you're describing the same framework that we talked about in COVID. How much risk was acceptable? But Elizabeth, I do want to go back to you to this idea about, you're almost hovering the line. You're an ambassador for the MAHA community on this project. Where is your thinking on this idea that the administration now, we are pro-industry, and this deregulation framework in this environment that you find yourself in, especially with this project? Do you feel that the administration is in line with what you're doing here?
I think this administration often contradicts itself. And, I think we see that in things like, what we hear from, Kennedy about issues like glyphosate, and then what we hear from the USDA, or the action that we see coming from the USDA in terms of some of these, pesticides, PFAS issues. I think there's a lot of contradiction in this administration. So, if you're asking me if I feel like HHS is working against me in this, absolutely not. If you ask me if I feel like sometimes EPA is letting people down, particularly in these types of issues, absolutely. Do I feel like the EPA is listening far too much to industry right now? That's my perception, although I'm not a part of those conversations. It's hard for me to answer, this administration as if it's a monolith, because I do feel like there's a lot of different arms that are moving in different directions and sometimes fighting each other.
And then, Nicole, I think the same question, like, how do you find your understanding of the different interests here, like, administration interests, MAHA interests, the science interests, all of that? Like, do you see that the things are in line, or do you find that there's some fractures? Like, what are you feeling as a scientist and a public health expert?
Yeah, on one hand, I feel like there's great opportunity to center the environment in the conversation and toxic chemicals. So I really like that this is getting the attention it needs. As I mentioned, we have hardly invested at all in our environmental infrastructure. We allow untested chemicals to be in our consumer products. We don't monitor appropriately for many chemicals. So I think there's just so much more that we could be doing. So I'm excited to have that be part of the conversation. But certainly, yeah, the EPA is not taking actions aligned with that. And Stuart is right too. This is not like a new issue. It's more than just the administration. It's kind of our society and sort of what we have kind of accepted. The drinking water standards, for example, haven't been updated in decades, and that crosses over many different leaders and administrations and political sides. And just now, the new PFAS standard was announced. Again, that took like 20 years to get on the books. I'm not sure where it stands, if it's getting undone or not. Science, we talked about science moves slowly, but then the regulations don't even keep pace with the slow science. So I hope we can start to see more evidence-based standards with the environment, more attention on that.
I kind of, something Nicole just said, I wanted to circle back to a question that Brenda asked Elizabeth about, is it strange that this MAHA group is kind of more conservative, and now they're aligning themselves with this idea of like toxins in the environment and everything? I just wanted to point out that like none of this is really new. Like the EPA was started by a Republican administration. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act were both bipartisan. And the flip side to that question is like, isn't it odd that liberals and Democrats pushed back so hard on RFK when he was talking about pesticides and food dyes and things, which are things that liberals have wanted out of our system for decades, right? So like, I think that there's tons of issues with the current political environment and this current administration that you can point to. I think their wholesale deregulation of the oil and gas and petrochemical industries is a disaster. But I don't think that we should pretend that these are like unique to just this administration, because this has all gone back and forth like a tennis match for, the last 50 plus years across both political, both sides of the political spectrum.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, and I would just like to add one item on this. I think MAHA and Kennedy are prioritizing a few select environmental issues, which is great for the people of East Palestine. It's great to get some attention, but as what Stuart was just alluding to, this is just such a systemic issue. And even with the food dyes, great to get food dyes out of foods. But I guess I worry as an environmental scientist that we kind of take these smaller wins that maybe might not have the biggest impact for the whole population, and we neglect kind of all these other problems, that there are so many Palestinians. There's so many different chemicals and issues. So it would be great to kind of broaden the lens with which we're looking at the environment.
You know, Stuart, I think you're bringing such a good point up, and this is a conversation I've had a lot with Elizabeth and other supporters of MAHA, which is, you know, what happens when a movement gets so politicized and it's, you know, doing two things that I think does turn a lot of liberals off, which is like it's aligned with Donald Trump. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that there's, I mean, I'm just going to say it. These guys, this is like, I'm a broken record on this, but what Bobby Kennedy and some of the MAHA leadership, how they talk about vaccines and things like that, really do turn a lot of liberals off, to the point of like not wanting to really show any support for anything, which in my view is a big mistake. It's the same thing the Democrats do with Trump, right? Because they find him to be such a threat. They can't give him like props on anything because he is a threat. John Clark wanted to jump in, our silent press member here. John.
Well, all of this has been really fascinating and educational, and I really am grateful, especially for the nuances of the response in East Palestine. But now we're veered off into my world of MAHA that I work in, and as I mentioned, I was at the EPA with Nancy Beck and others last Monday. And I just want to express that many of us in the MAHA movement, which is very bipartisan, I'm a conservative, but I walked away from the Democratic Party largely on environmental issues because I'm a farmer. And Barack Obama and Joe Biden put Mr. Vilsack, Mr. Monsanto in charge. Both parties have been allowing regulatory capture. And we're in a battle in this administration between Bobby, who's trying to change that, and yes, the EPA and USDA are, I believe, disappointingly lost to industry. But they're losing to us because this is grassroots. And you're right. And actually, polls show that what draws most people to the MAHA movement is not vaccine issues, because people are very entrenched on that. It's food issues. It's water quality issues. It's PFAs in your drinking water. It's obesity, diabetes, endocrine disruptors, cancer rates increasing. People have become aware, and Bobby has really helped do that. Whatever other people think of him, and even in this case, he was on the ground with you before he was running for office, and he has decades of working on environmental issues. So I'm not even trying to be defensive here. I'm trying to say I think there's hope for our country on these issues, that it's been a bipartisan capture of regulatory agencies, and it must be a bipartisan response, a grassroots response. And what you're doing here, and even advertising and talking about your experience in East Palestine, is part of that battle. It's why I'm here and why I write and why I do what I do. I have grandkids, and I don't want them drinking this crap. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do, but I assure you that Bobby's trying, and he's up against a juggernaut.
Thank you, John.
Stuart, I just want to ask you a question about sort of where all this goes. You know Nicole, you believe in Nicole's work, you believe in Nicole's expertise. If in months, years, she comes back with the results and says, I cannot find anything that's contaminating this water, will you trust that? Will you trust her?
Yeah, I will. You know, I will trust Nicole and the other scientists working on this because I think they will be coming at it from a purely scientific perspective and not the perspective of managing narratives, managing politics, and managing economics. And I just want to say one last comment, that I'm here talking about East Palestine because I'm kind of located by it. But to me, the work I do on our show is all about oil and gas, petrochemicals, and other extractive industries. And I have to say that what happened in East Palestine is simply emblematic of a much larger, more systemic issue that spans all kinds of nooks and crannies and corners of our country, our world, our economies. And that's really why I care so much about what happens in East Palestine, because I see it as this emblem for a much bigger set of issues.
Well, on that note, you know, we just want to say this is a project that we intend on following. We are so thrilled that you all are working together to do this. We wanted to, you know, to our audience, this is just the first of a series of episodes as these guys do their work on the ground. You know, we want to just kind of show people what they're doing. It's just, to me, exciting. It could maybe serve as a model for some sort of collaboration, partnership, coalition building. To John's point, John Clar's point, there have been some really interesting partnerships that have been coming up in this time period. We have been collaborating with folks like John Clar and bringing them together with some interesting people in the scientific community. So we'll kind of give you some hints to that in the future. But I just want to say, Nicole, Elizabeth, Stuart, I just hope you know that this is really providing hope and inspiration to a lot of people at a time of division and a sense of I know many people in the scientific community feeling helpless, and even some people in the MAHA community who may be feeling like there's too many obstructive forces in government. You guys are sort of taking action back and doing something on the ground. I hope you see that. I'm so grateful to you for what you're doing and for joining us on this podcast today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And we are all thinking and praying for the people of this community that those results come back negative and they can move forward and have some peace of mind.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that is our show for today. Please send us questions and comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. If you're interested in the work and following this work, let us know, and we'll point to some resources in the show notes for you guys as well to look at. I am Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. She is Maggie Bartlett. He is Dr. Mark Abdul Malik. That was Nicole Deziel, Stuart Day, Elizabeth Frost, and John Clar. And we will be right back here next week.